Hey everyone, it's Joel Howe, and this is a bouncing ball tutorial for Adobe After Effects. Let's get started with a new composition in Adobe After Effects. I'm going to keep this small so we can keep it on the screen. If you choose a preset, you can see 1080p, or I'm going to choose 720 just so that we can keep everything on the screen. I typically like to do 30 frames per second. And so 1280 by 720, and background color black is fine. Once we have our composition, I should probably name this. So bouncing ball comp. All right. Once we create our composition, now you'll see we actually have the composition area that we can look at here in the composition window. The comp itself is listed in the project as an asset. And we have our timeline. Every composition has its own timeline. So this is a basic tutorial. So to create our ball, I'm going to make a new shape layer. So we won't be importing a graphic. We'll just be creating a simple shape layer here. And I'm going to, you can see the shape layer is down here in the timeline. And here I'm going to use the ellipse tool. And you'll see that this is set to the tool creates a shape, not a mask, but a shape. And so if I click and drag in the composition window, I can create a ball. It should be circular. So I'm going to hold the Shift key to lock our aspect ratio. So here's our shape layer. And one thing that I want to do that's very important for the ball itself is to get this anchor point that's in the middle to the center of the ball. So I'm going to go up and choose the pan behind, which is also the anchor point tool, and click off and then back on so I can see this anchor point, and now just drag that over right to the middle. So so this is going to let us later on, if we want to squash the ball or even rotate the ball on its center, then it will be, oops, must have dragged that off a little bit. All right, there we go. It'll rotate on its center. And you know what, I can just zoom in here so that we can see this a little bit more. It's a little laggy when I drag that for some reason, maybe the screen recording software. All right, so that's our ball, and it's centered. Let me change the name of this layer. I'm just going to hit enter and shape layer ball. Now this is a bouncing ball animation, so I will add a ground element, or we could actually just have it bounce on the very bottom of the screen. It's very easy to make a new shape layer. And on this shape layer, just use the rectangle tool and just draw a rectangle. And I'll do this and rename this layer to ground. I'll move it below. Doesn't really matter because these will overlap, but in this case, if the ball will appear on top of the ground. And the last thing I'll do is just lock this layer so that I don't have to, I can't select it by accident now. So the only layer I can really work with here is the ball. So I think we're in pretty good shape at this point. So we want to animate the actual position of the ball, and then we can get into some easing and some principles of animation as we go. To do that, make sure that you twirl down your transform options here, transform properties, and you'll see anchor point, position, scale, rotation. Make sure that it's the transform properties for the layer, because notice that for a shape layer, you can also have a set of transforms for a specific shape, because you can have multiple shapes on a shape layer. So make sure that we're on the actual layer transform here. Okay. Actually, one thing I didn't do here, it looks like we have a lot of frames in our timeline, and I want to keep this animation pretty short. So if I go to composition settings and we look at our current duration, we're at a fairly long time here. Actually, let me show this trick. We have, if I control click, I can show frames or I can show time. And we're looking at almost 2 minutes of animation here. So that was whatever my last composition setting was. So let me change that to not to 2 minutes, but just 10 seconds of animation for now. It will probably be even shorter. But now you can see there's 1 second up to 10 seconds. And if we go all the way to the end, you can also use the end key and the home key. You can see we're at 9 minutes and 29 frames, or 9 seconds and 29 frames. I like to keep this on frames in a lot of cases, just because of the it's a little clearer when I'm jumping ahead or back a certain number of frames. So with our timeline set to 10 seconds at 30 frames per second or 300 frames, now I can start at frame 0 and start animating. We've got a position property that I want to change. So the first thing I'll do is select my ball and bring it off the screen so that it's off the screen. We're going to have it start here. It's going to come down and bounce. It'll go through a bounce here, and then maybe another bounce there, and then it'll go off the screen over here. So we kind of have a full lifetime of this life cycle of this ball entering and leaving, and it doesn't need to come to rest or anything. So I'm going to change the position over time. To make sure to have that happen in After Effects, I need to start to set some keyframes. And so I turn on my time vary stopwatch icon here, and you'll see that turns blue, and it creates a keyframe at that current time, at time 0, frame 0. And so now I can jump ahead, let's say to frame, let's say frame 50 for now. And this will be a very slow bounce. And I'm just going to click and drag this. If you can see, it's already created another keyframe. So we've got a keyframe at frame 50. And I'll drag this down so it's basically coming in contact with the ground. Maybe a little overlap because I might squash that ball later. And I'll just keep going. And I'll go to frame 100. And I'll drag it up here. You can see a motion path is starting to be drawn as we go through this. Frame 150. Oops. Grab the handles. Control Z to undo that. And every time I move the ball on the screen, I end up creating a new keyframe. So I've moved my current time indicator to forward another 50 frames. So I'm at frame 200 now, and it's here. And the bounces are going to get smaller as we go. And 250. Try to get those exactly on. And this is a bounce here. And then the last one is off the screen there. Okay. And I'm not exactly precise with these, especially that one at the end. But let's see, if I go through and I hit the space bar, we have some basic bouncing motion. This is not great, but it's a start. And we can see After Effects interpolating between our keyframes. So we create the keyframes at the extreme points of the animation motion, and After Effects kind of fills in between those. So what I would like to do is, at this point, we need to start to incorporate some of the principles of animation. Number one, I'm going to just move these around spatially to try to make an even distribution of these keyframes going horizontally, because the ball is going to kind of move in a linear fashion across the screen horizontally, even though it's going to be kind of accelerating and decelerating up and down due to gravity. So you can see here our motion path has dots that show a consistent spacing of the dots along the path. That means that this motion is pretty much at a uniform speed or velocity as it goes through. And so what I'd like to do is let's go to this first keyframe at 0, and I'm going to select and right click on that keyframe, and I'll say easy ease out. Now what just happened is you can see that the dots here are closer together at the beginning, and they get further and further apart. So this ball starts slow and then accelerates, and I think I want to do that for both for all these peaks. What we're trying to emulate is the idea of the ball bouncing off the ground and having some speed up and then slowing because of gravity before it starts to fall again. So at frame 100 we're at the peak, and at frame 200 we're at the peak. And I've selected those two keyframes. You can shift click to select multiple keyframes. Again, I'll choose keyframe assistant. This is actually going off the recording screen, so it's keyframe assistant, and I'll choose easy ease. And so you should see, again, these are getting closer together at the peak. So if I were to hit spacebar and RAM preview this, we're actually getting a very pronounced easing. And it's not at all what we want in terms of the motion, but it actually represents this easing, this slowing down as we reach a keyframe. So we're on the right track. At this point, I think it's important to start to look at our motion path. So right now we've got a bounce that that has kind of a swooping bounce down, and I want to change the shape of these so that we have more of an arc at the top, and you can see the handles here. Seems to be a little bit of a graphics issue there, but when we have bounces at the bottom, we don't want to have this kind of smooth motion. We want to have a sharp pop as the ball comes up. So this would be a smooth motion with the basically we're controlling the shape of the motion path as it passes through this keyframe, and it's tangent. It's a smooth shape. So we get this floaty effect right now. But if I select this and I drag one side up, and then I hold the Control and Alt keys, I can break the connection between those two handles and end up with something that's much sharper. And so you can see basically, I'll do that over here where the ball's not here. I'll drag this up and just have it generally point towards that keyframe. And the same thing here. So I'm going to drag that and that. And so this gives us a much sharper bounce, and it's starting to let me see there's some inconsistencies in the path here. But let's just do a quick preview, and I think this is getting much better. So that shape change of the motion path really helps, particularly in the first bounce. I think that looks really good. So next up, you may want to save this at some point. Now's a good time to save if you haven't done that. What I'd like to do next is the bouncing effect is working well in terms of the overall shape. The easing that we have, where it slows to a stop at the apex of a bounce, is really limiting the realism here. In the horizontal direction, there shouldn't be any easing in the sense that it shouldn't come to a stop as it's heading in this direction. So we have to, what I'd like to do now is basically separate the horizontal and the vertical motion. So let's stop this and back to frame 0, and we have a position. And what I'd like to do is if I right click on the position property in the transform for a given layer, there's a separate dimensions or separate dimensions option. And when I do that, it changes from an x and from a single position value to an x and y position. And this is great because it lets us right now the animation's unchanged. Right now we've got still the same motion. It's still coming to a stop. But what I want to show now is if we go to the timeline or the graph editor in the timeline, we can see that the X position and the Y position are very different. And I'm going to just drag this up so that we have a little more room here. Our X position is our horizontal position. And you can see that we have, in this case, it goes and then stops, eases, and so there's easing in here, and there's little controls that allow us to basically have the ball stop. And I want to take those and make this much more linear. So if I take those keyframes and we control these, I really want, ideally, this bouncing ball to be a straight line. So I can grab these handles. Actually, I'm just going to Alt-click and make these all linear with no handles. And now you can look at it and say, okay, that's... and I'm just going to drag these vertically and basically make a straight line. As long as it's close, we should be all set. And to be honest, we could actually delete these keyframes in here if we wanted to. But if we look at the result now, we've got our horizontal motion is actually pretty linear going across. So now we just have to fix that vertical motion. And again, if we head back to our timeline and we take a look, X position is fine, our Y position is here. And we can start to control how we fix things. Now this is this bounce pattern is basically upside down because of the way After Effects tracks vertical position. But I'm taking these handles and I'm dragging them out, and you'll see the changes on the screen as well. So that, and I'm holding Alt. I can click that to make it linear, and click it again to create the Bezier handles. And that's getting us a more smooth arc across the top again. So we're basically recreating some of the work that had to be done in the previously. But this is going to give us a very smooth, this is going to give us our easing in the vertical direction without any easing in the horizontal. Just out of curiosity, I'm just going to shift click these keyframes and hit the delete key. So that gives us basically a perfectly linear piece. Okay. So now if I look at the ball, it's slow, but it looks pretty good. Now, I think there's still some work that could be done if we get out of the graph editor and back to the timeline. We could look at the different heights and the timing and spacing of the highs and lows. These are spaced out evenly from our beginning. So I think what we would end up doing is I would want this bounce to be over here a little bit more. So if I start to move this keyframe and I start to move these, you can see how that's updating the actual motion path. And we could hop back if we want to make some adjustments in terms of the smoothness of the curve. And I might smooth this out a little bit, make that a little bit bigger. There we go. So I think that's looking pretty good. And the graph editor is great for tweaking that. All right, so I'm pretty happy with the bouncing ball and the motion and the easing. But what we still need to do is I still need to actually it's a little slow, and I wanted to show this technique. Overall, I can grab all my keyframes, and if I like the overall animation here. I don't like the pace. So let me take this and I'm going to basically reduce it by I selected all the keyframes. Again, I can basically just click and drag a rectangular selection there, and I'm gonna if I just click and drag all these keys, they move horizontally. So I can change the timing of the animation here by having it start earlier or later. Let me undo that. But if I hold the Alt key down and then I drag and I click, it's actually going to change the overall timing of the animation without affecting the start point. So I can basically speed up an animation this way. And so that's what we have here. If I now I've got something that's a little faster, and I could even cut that in half again. So if I grab those and we all drag down to 150, this is pretty much the original. And now I'm just going to bring the work area down. All right, so that looks good. If you like that, you can also trim your comp to the work area so that the composition is only as long as the work area. All right, things are looking great right now. The only thing I think we have left to do is some squash and stretch. So when our bouncing ball hits the and this is one of the issues you can when you scale like that, sometimes your keyframes are not exactly on a given frame. It basically does the math for you. So sometimes you'll need to just kind of drag those to get those right on a frame again. But in this case here, our ball is, I can bring this back down. Our ball is on the ground, and what I'd like to do is, if I go back one frame, I'm going to hit Control and left arrow to go back just one frame. I'd like the ball to be fully intact here in terms of being round, but be kind of squashed as it lands here. So this will be a scale option, and so I'm going to turn on the stopwatch for scale. So we're going to change scale over time. And so I just want to kind of go through and I'm going to scale is by default 100%. So on each, so I created 2 keyframes right here on each side of the bottom of the bounce where it's 100%. So now I can go between the two, and I'm going to unclick this link if this link is selected, scale is basically locked in both the X and Y direction. And so I don't want that. I want to unclick that and be able to squash this in the vertical direction and expand it in the horizontal direction, so that I get between the 3 frames. Again, I'm going to use Control and left arrow. I've got a fully intact spherical ball here. It's bouncing at the bottom, and then it's back to its spherical shape here. And now I can do the same thing over here. One thing to save myself some time, I'm going to select these keys here, Control V to copy, or Control C to copy, Control V to paste, and then I'll just drag them so they're centered, so that that scale can be in the exact same location. And it doesn't look like this is low enough, so I'm going to bring that a little bit lower. And is this the other bounce? And again, this is just off in terms of being on a specific frame, so I'm going to put that there. And I'm going to Control C, Control V, and I'll just drag those. So again, that's 100% scale, and then our squash and stretched version, and then 100% scale again as it comes off the off the ground. All right, so let's fit this, and let's see what this looks like. So it's only 1 frame, but it gives us just a little bit of bounce. We can see that 1 frame, and we could expand that if we wanted to make it a little more pronounced. So let me zoom in here, and we could drag this back and this here so that we could use interpolation. So we could be at 100% here, and then we're starting to squash and stretch, and then we fully squash and stretch. And that will give you it doesn't look right here because obviously a ball wouldn't squash until it actually hits the ground. But this can certainly make it a more smooth, a more visible effect. And it happens very quickly, so in those few frames, we're not really visually processing that. One thing I will add in here is the idea of motion blur. So for a given layer, we can turn on motion blur using this checkbox right here. And to see it in the composition, we just turn on this enable motion blur. And you'll see that After Effects is looking at the speed and can enable motion blur. So that should help visually. We'll see a little more blur and a little more of an effect there. So that's not a bad effect. We'll expand that out a little bit so that we get a little more bounce. And for a slower animation, we could spend more time and get a little more creative with the bouncing at the ground level. But for right now, I think I'm pretty happy with that. So that's it. We've got a bouncing ball, and we can render this out as video, or put a background in, or go in and start to make the ground more interesting, or add shadows or cracks or other things. But this is a good starting point for bouncing ball animation. Thanks for watching.